History often feels complete when we look at it from a distance. Dates are recorded, empires rise and fall, and timelines appear neatly connected. But when we look closer, something unsettling begins to appear, not what is written, but what is missing. Between well-known civilizations and familiar stories, there are long stretches of silence where history offers no clear answers. In these quiet gaps, entire societies once existed. They lived, organized themselves, raised families, built communities, and understood the world in their own way. Yet today, their presence survives only as fragments, faint traces in the soil, subtle patterns in the landscape, or objects whose purpose we no longer fully understand. There are no final records explaining what happened. No clear moment of collapse. Just an absence that feels deliberate, but unexplained. This silence is not the result of a single lost document or an unfinished excavation. It is deeper than that. It is the kind of silence that forms when a civilization disappears without leaving behind a clear narrative of its own ending. Archaeologists encounter it when layers of human activity simply stop. Historians feel it when timelines break without transition. And we sense it when questions remain unanswered despite decades of study. What makes this silence so unsettling is that it challenges a basic assumption we often carry, that civilizations always leave clear traces behind, and that decline is always dramatic or visible. But history does not always unfold in obvious ways. Sometimes it fades instead of collapsing. Sometimes it withdraws rather than ending. Today's story begins in one of these silent spaces. It is not about a great battle or a sudden disaster. It is about a civilization that once existed and then quietly was no longer there. To understand what happened, we must begin not with what history tells us, but with what it refuses to say. What remains today is not a myth, nor a story built on speculation alone. The civilization at the center of this discussion is supported by physical evidence, subtle, fragmented, but undeniably real. Beneath layers of soil and time, archaeologists have uncovered signs of long-term human presence that point to an organized and enduring society. These traces appear in the form of structured settlements, repeated habitation layers, and tools designed for specific purposes. The layout of dwellings suggests planning rather than randomness. Storage pits, work areas, and shared spaces indicate cooperation and social structure. This was not a temporary camp or a fleeting occupation. It was a place where people lived generation after generation. Artifacts recovered from these sites reveal consistency in design and craftsmanship. Pottery styles repeat across wide areas, implying shared cultural norms. Tools show signs of refinement, repair, and adaptation over time, suggesting accumulated knowledge rather than isolated invention. In some locations, evidence of trade appears through materials sourced from distant regions, pointing to broader networks of interaction. Perhaps most telling is the duration of occupation. Radiocarbon dating shows continuous human activity over centuries. This society survived seasonal changes, environmental pressures, and the challenges of sustaining a population. Such endurance requires systems, methods of food production, social coordination, and knowledge transmission that do not emerge by accident. And yet, despite all this, the evidence stops. Layers that once recorded daily life suddenly end. Structures are not rebuilt. Tools are no longer replaced. The signs of maintenance and continuity vanish without transition. The civilization did not slowly degrade into chaos, nor does it appear to have been abruptly destroyed. Instead, its material presence simply ceases. This combination, clear proof of a complex, lasting society followed by an equally clear absence, is what transforms curiosity into mystery. The civilization existed. It functioned. It endured. And then, without explanation written into the ground, it was gone. The scale of what has been uncovered makes one conclusion unavoidable. This was not a small, fragile, or loosely connected group of people. The evidence points instead to a society of significant size, capable of sustaining itself over long periods and coordinating life across entire regions. Settlement patterns show multiple habitation sites existing at the same time, rather than a single isolated community. These sites share architectural similarities, tool designs, and cultural markers, suggesting they were part of a larger system rather than independent villages. Such consistency implies communication, shared norms, and some form of collective identity that extended beyond local boundaries. Population estimates, based on housing density and resource use, indicate numbers far beyond what a simple subsistence group could maintain. Supporting this, many people would have required reliable food production, storage strategies, and an understanding of seasonal cycles. This level of planning reflects experience accumulated over generations, not experimentation or chance. There are also signs of labor specialization. Not all tools serve the same function, and not all dwellings are identical. Some areas appear dedicated to production, others to storage or communal activity. This suggests that individuals likely held different roles within the society, contributing specific skills rather than performing identical tasks. Such differentiation is a hallmark of social complexity. What is especially striking is the absence of improvisation. Structures follow repeated patterns. Resource use appears measured rather than opportunistic. The society functioned with a sense of order, one that allowed it to persist and adapt rather than merely survive. Because of this, the idea that the civilizations simply dissolved due to weakness becomes difficult to accept. Societies of this scale do not vanish easily or unnoticed. They leave ripples, transitions, overlaps, or transformations into something new. Yet here there is no clear successor and no gradual reshaping into another known culture. This is what deepens the mystery. A society capable of organization, endurance, and growth does not disappear casually. Its absence suggests a cause far more complex than fragility and far more deliberate than simple failure. One of the first explanations often considered when a civilization disappears is conflict. War leaves marks that are difficult to erase: damaged structures, scattered weapons, defensive fortifications, or abrupt layers of destruction. Yet in this case, such evidence is notably absent. Excavation sites do not reveal burned settlements or collapsed buildings caused by violence. Walls are not shattered, and living spaces do not show signs of sudden abandonment under threat. Tools and everyday objects are not scattered in ways that suggest panic or flight. Instead, what is found appears orderly, as if daily life ended without chaos. Weapons, where they exist at all, are limited and consistent with hunting or basic protection rather than large-scale combat. There are no mass graves, no concentrated injuries on skeletal remains, and no indication of prolonged siege or organized conflict. For a society of this size, such silence is unusual. Even brief wars tend to leave traces that endure for centuries. Equally telling is the lack of defensive architecture. There are no fortified walls, watch structures, or barriers built in anticipation of attack. This suggests that warfare was not a dominant pressure shaping the society's final years. If external threats existed, they were not intense enough to force drastic defensive changes. This absence does not mean conflict was entirely unknown. Minor disputes or localized violence likely occurred, as they do in all human societies. But nothing points to a destructive event powerful enough to erase an entire civilization from a landscape. The lack of violence challenges a familiar narrative. History often teaches us that civilizations end in fire and struggle, brought down by enemies or internal collapse. Here, that story does not fit. The ground tells a quieter tale, one in which people did not flee burning cities or fall to invading forces. By removing warfare from the list of clear explanations, the mystery deepens. If this civilization did not end through conquest or destruction, then its disappearance must be explained by forces far less visible and far harder to trace through physical remains. Another explanation often used to account for the disappearance of ancient societies is natural disaster. Earthquakes, floods, prolonged droughts, or volcanic activity have ended civilizations before, leaving clear signals in the archaeological record. Layers of ash, sediment deposits, abrupt climate shifts, or widespread destruction usually mark such events. Yet here, those signs are missing. The environmental data does not point to a single catastrophic moment. Soil layers remain stable without the disruption expected from massive flooding or seismic upheaval. There is no widespread ash that would indicate volcanic activity, nor is there evidence of a rapid, extreme climate shift that would have made the region suddenly uninhabitable. Instead, the surrounding environment appears largely continuous before, during, and after the civilization's disappearance. Long-term climate changes are always a possibility, but even gradual environmental pressure typically leaves behind adaptation strategies. Societies facing declining resources tend to alter settlement patterns. adjust food production, or shift toward new ecological zones. These transitions usually appear in the archaeological record as changes in tools, architecture, or resource use. In this case, such gradual adjustments are difficult to identify. Equally important is what is not found: no mass abandonment during a single season, no emergency storage left behind, and no evidence of communities desperately responding to sudden environmental stress. Daily life does not appear to have been interrupted by panic or survival-driven decisions. This absence matters because natural disasters are among the most visible forces in history. When they strike, they leave unmistakable scars on both landscapes and human behavior. Their impact is rarely subtle. By ruling out a clear, natural catastrophe, the mystery becomes more complex. If neither violence nor environmental collapse forced this civilization to disappear, then the explanation must lie elsewhere, possibly in processes that unfolded quietly, gradually, and without leaving dramatic physical traces behind. When faced with a disappearance that leaves so little behind, scholars often turn first to the most familiar explanations. Migration, cultural assimilation, and gradual decline are commonly proposed because they require no sudden catastrophe and can occur without dramatic physical evidence. At first glance, these ideas seem reasonable. Migration suggests that the population slowly relocated, perhaps in response to changing resources or social pressures. If this were the case, traces of movement would normally appear: temporary settlements along routes, shifts in material culture, or the emergence of similar traditions in nearby regions. Yet such patterns are difficult to trace with confidence here. The cultural signatures associated with this society do not clearly reappear elsewhere in a recognizable form. Assimilation offers another possibility. Over time, smaller or less dominant societies may merge into neighboring cultures, losing their distinct identity while contributing to a larger whole. This process usually leaves blended traditions, shared technologies, or transitional styles. However, in this case, there is no clear evidence of such continuity. The defining characteristics of a civilization seem to stop rather than evolve. Gradual decline is perhaps the safest explanation of all. Societies can weaken over generations due to economic strain, internal imbalance, or social fragmentation. But decline typically produces visible change: reduced construction, simplified tools, or shrinking settlements. Here, the archaeological record does not show a long downward slope. Instead, it shows activity followed by absence. These early explanations reflect an understandable desire to fit the unknown into familiar historical patterns. They offer comfort in their simplicity, suggesting that nothing truly unusual occurred. Yet each explanation, when examined closely, leaves significant gaps. The more scholars rely on these models, the more apparent their limitations become. Rather than resolving the mystery, they highlight how little is actually understood about the final chapter of this civilization's existence. As these early explanations are examined more closely, their weaknesses become increasingly difficult to ignore. Each theory accounts for part of the picture, but none fully explains the abrupt and complete nature of the disappearance. The inconsistencies do not lie in a lack of effort by researchers, but in the evidence itself. If migration had occurred on a large scale, the movement of people would have left some form of archaeological trail. Populations do not relocate silently. They carry tools, traditions, and habits with them. These cultural markers tend to appear in new regions, even if they evolve over time. In this case, such continuity is missing. The cultural identity does not resurface elsewhere in a recognizable way. Assimilation presents a similar challenge. Cultural blending is rarely invisible. It usually produces transitional artifacts, shared techniques, or overlapping traditions. The absence of these markers suggests that if assimilation occurred, it did so without leaving the expected material traces, a possibility that becomes harder to accept as the scale of the civilization grows. Gradual decline, too, raises questions. Societies under long-term stress tend to simplify rather than vanish. Construction slows, craftsmanship changes, and settlements shrink. Here, the record shows no extended phase of deterioration. Activity appears stable until it stops, offering no clear warning signs of collapse. Perhaps the most troubling issue is timing. The end of occupation across multiple sites appears broadly consistent, as though a shared process affected the entire society within a relatively narrow window. Such coordination is difficult to reconcile with slow, independent decline, or scattered migration. These unresolved problems force a reconsideration of the assumptions guiding interpretation. The disappearance may not fit comfortably into known historical models. Instead of a familiar ending, it suggests a process that unfolded quietly, systematically, and in a way that resists easy classification. Rather than closing the case, these explanations expose how much remains unexplained and how fragile our confidence can be when history refuses to behave as expected. As conventional explanations fail to provide satisfying answers, attention gradually turns inward toward the methods used to interpret the past. Archaeology, like all sciences, relies on patterns on what usually happens when societies grow, change, or disappear. But this case disrupts those expectations, forcing scholars to confront the possibility that they may be looking for the wrong signals. Much of what we recognize as history depends on durable materials. Stone structures, fired pottery, metal tools, and written records survive long enough to be studied. Societies that relied on perishable materials, wood, textiles, organic compounds, are far more vulnerable to erasure. When these materials decay, they leave behind only faint impressions, easily missed or misinterpreted. This raises an uncomfortable question: how many civilizations are invisible not because they were insignificant, but because they built differently? A society can be complex, organized, and influential without producing monuments meant to last thousands of years. If its knowledge was transmitted orally, and its architecture adapted to the environment rather than resisting it, its disappearance might appear far more complete than it truly was. There is also the issue of expectation. Archaeologists often search for collapse in the form of destruction layers or dramatic change. When those markers are absent, the tendency is to assume continuity or misinterpret the silence as insignificance. But silence can also mean withdrawal, transformation, or deliberate abandonment processes that leave few physical clues. In this sense, the disappearance challenges not just historical narratives, but the tools used to construct them. It suggests that the archaeological record may reflect survival bias, preserving only those societies that built in ways compatible with deep time. What remains may not be the full story of the human past, but only the portion that managed to endure physically while entire worlds quietly faded beyond our ability to recognize them. One of the most powerful factors shaping what we remember about the past is not importance, but endurance. Civilizations that built with stone, carved their stories into hard surfaces, or recorded their lives in lasting materials are far more likely to be remembered. Those that relied on organic resources or oral tradition faced a very different fate. Writing systems, made of wood, bark, or soft materials rarely survive long enough to be recovered. Architecture built from earth, timber, or plant-based materials can vanish within centuries, especially when exposed to climate and reuse. Even tools and everyday objects, if made from biodegradable materials, leave little behind once a society stops maintaining them. This creates a distorted view of history. It gives the impression that complex societies only existed where monuments still stand. In reality, complexity does not require permanence. A civilization can be sophisticated without aspiring to last forever in physical form. When such societies disappear, their absence is often mistaken for non-existence. Without inscriptions to translate or ruins to excavate, there is nothing to anchor them firmly in historical timelines. Over time, their memory dissolves, not because they were unimportant, but because they left behind nothing that resisted decay. This may explain why the civilization in question appears to vanish so completely. Its systems of knowledge, belief, and organization may have been embedded in practices rather than objects. Once those practices ended, there was nothing tangible left to signal their former presence. What survives in the ground is only a faint outline, a negative space where activity once took place. And because modern history depends so heavily on physical remains, these civilizations are often overlooked, their stories reduced to gaps rather than chapters. In this way, disappearance is not always an event. Sometimes it is the slow erasure of memory, carried out by time, environment, and the limits of what humans choose to preserve. When all visible causes fail to explain what happened, a more subtle possibility begins to emerge. That disappearance was not the result of collapse, but of choice. Not a single decision made at one moment, but a gradual, collective shift away from the structures that once defined the civilization. Societies are often imagined as fixed entities, bound to cities, borders, and permanent settlements. Yet history shows that humans are capable of reorganizing themselves in ways that leave little physical trace. A civilization can abandon large-scale architecture, disperse into smaller communities, or redefine identity in ways that no longer align with how archaeologists recognize continuity. In this scenario, people do not vanish. What vanishes is the system that made them visible. Centralized settlements may be abandoned in favor of mobility. Social hierarchies may dissolve into simpler forms of organization. Cultural identity may persist, but without the symbols and materials that once expressed it. Such a transformation would leave behind exactly what we observe: an orderly ending without destruction, no signs of panic, and no clear successor culture that can be easily identified. Instead of collapse, there is withdrawal. Instead of extinction, there is adaptation. This idea challenges a deeply rooted assumption that progress always moves toward greater complexity and permanence. It suggests that survival may sometimes require the opposite, becoming less visible, less centralized, and less dependent on structures that tie a society to one place. If this civilization chose to transform rather than endure in recognizable form, then its disappearance is not a failure of resilience, but a different expression of it. The people continued, but the civilization, as we define it, did not. And in that distinction lies one of the most unsettling possibilities of all: that some civilizations are not lost because they were destroyed, but because they succeeded in leaving history behind. Human understanding of the past depends on narrative. We expect stories to have beginnings, developments, and endings that make sense. When civilizations collapse, we search for causes. When they transform, we look for transitions. But when neither appears clearly, the absence itself becomes deeply unsettling. The civilization discussed here resists closure. There is no defining event to point to, no final chapter that explains why it ended. Instead, there is only a quiet break in continuity. Settlements cease. Material culture stops. And history offers no concluding explanation. This lack of resolution creates discomfort not only for historians, but for modern audiences as well. It challenges the belief that knowledge is always recoverable, that every past can be reconstructed if we search long enough. In reality, some stories are permanently incomplete, shaped by what time allows us to see. The silence left behind feels unnatural because it does not fit familiar patterns. There is no dramatic fall to analyze, no clear warning signs to interpret. The disappearance seems to deny the expectation that civilizations must leave behind lessons written in ruins or records. Yet this discomfort reveals something important. It exposes how dependent our understanding of history is on survival rather than truth. What we know is not necessarily what mattered most, but what endured long enough to be found. By confronting an unfinished history, we are forced to accept uncertainty as part of the human past. Not every civilization can be neatly explained, and not every ending can be known. Some are defined precisely by what they withhold. And in acknowledging that uncertainty, history becomes less about control and more about humility and understanding that the past is far larger, quieter, and more elusive than we often assume. The disappearance of this civilization ultimately tells us as much about ourselves as it does about the past. It exposes the assumptions we bring into the study of history, what we expect to find, and what we are prepared to recognize as meaningful. When a society leaves behind no clear ending, our discomfort often reflects a desire for certainty rather than an absence of significance. This absence forces a reconsideration of how many human stories may never be told. For every civilization remembered through monuments and records, there may be countless others that lived full, complex lives and left without leaving behind durable proof. Their achievements, beliefs, and struggles existed fully in their time, even if they are invisible to us now. It also raises questions about permanence. Modern societies often equate survival with visibility cities, infrastructure, and data designed to last indefinitely. Yet the past suggests that endurance in memory is not guaranteed, and that complexity alone does not ensure remembrance. What survives is shaped by material choices, environmental conditions, and chance. By reflecting on a civilization that vanished without a trace, we are reminded that history is not a complete archive, but a selective one. It preserves fragments, not totals. Understanding this limits our certainty, but it also deepens our perspective. The story does not end with an answer, because there may be none to recover. Instead, it leaves us with a quieter realization that human civilization has always been more widespread, more fragile, and more temporary than the record suggests. In the end, the greatest mystery may not be why this civilization disappeared, but how many others shared the same fate, existing fully, meaningfully, and completely before time chose not to remember them at all. When we look back across the long span of human history, it is easy to believe that what we see is the full story. Ruins, artifacts, and written records give the impression of completeness. But the civilization we have explored today reminds us that history is not a perfect record, it is a collection of what managed to remain. Some societies fell loudly and were remembered because of it. Others endured quietly and vanished just as quietly, leaving behind no final message, no warning, and no explanation we can fully recover. Their absence is not a failure of existence, but a reminder of how selective memory can be. This story does not offer a clear conclusion, because history itself does not always provide one. Instead, it invites reflection on how civilizations rise, how they adapt, and how easily even complex human worlds can slip beyond recognition. What remains unanswered may be just as important as what is known. If you find yourself unsettled by this uncertainty, that reaction is part of the story. It means we are still listening to the silence left behind, still questioning the shape of the past, and still aware that human history is far larger than the fragments we can see. Thank you for spending this time exploring a forgotten chapter of humanity with us. If you enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about history, mystery, and the quiet edges of civilization, feel free to stay with the channel. Until next time, take care and keep wondering.